Welcome to the Industry Wants deep dive on greenhouse gas emissions metric. I am Karen, the project manager for the Industry We Want, here to introduce you to our initiative and to kick off our session with Michael Zadowski, climate expert and research consultant to the World Resource Institute, WRI, and working closely with the Apparel Impact Institute, AII, on this report. And also Joelle Mertens, Director of HIG Product Tools at the Sustainable Apparel Coalitions. So we have approximately 60 minutes scheduled for this session. We'll start off with some brief reintroductions to the industry we want and our industry dashboard, and then I'll hand it over to Michael and Joelle for a deeper look at the research and the data behind the greenhouse gas emissions metric, namely their 2021 roadmap to net zero, delivering science-based targets in the apparel sector report, developed by WRI and AII. The report uses the data from the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and the Textile Exchange, and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and HIG have also provided the calculations in the report. Now, in collaboration with the industry we want, now in collaboration with the industry we want, we are excited to announce this data set to be annually updated by AII to unveil where the industry stands, presenting the total estimated emissions for the apparel sector in gigatons until 2025. So after Michael and Joelle's presentation, I will invite Olivia Windham-Stewart, Senior Advisor to the Industry We Want, and independent business and human rights specialist to join us for the Q&A and allow all of you to ask questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the session, as we will have time to get to it at the end. And if there aren't that many questions, we may even finish a bit early. So let's get started. So as a quick reminder, the Industry We Want was initiated by the Ethical Trade Initiative, ETI, and Fairwear to really accelerate progress on social, commercial, and environmental issues in the garment and footwear sector, really looking holistically at the approach. So we are very pleased to have been joined in our endeavors by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition as a lead organization, and have benefited hugely from the partnership of many industry experts and widespread industry consultation and input, including from the Apparel Impact Institute, our partner on the industry environmental impact metric. And here you see an overview of on the previous slide, you saw an overview of the different data partners that we have that I will be referring to later for the industry dashboard. Now, to remind those of you who have participated in our activities previously, but more importantly, to familiarize those of you who are new to the industry we want, our shared vision is a garment and footwear industry that realizes its full potential to ensure dignity for workers in decent jobs, thriving businesses along the supply chain, and really a positive impact on the planet. And as indicated in this vision statement, the three pillars of our initiative are social, commercial, and environmental. And within each of these pillars, we have determined and identified key focus areas. This was done in consultation with affected stakeholders and industry experts last year. So for the social pillar, our focus area is wages, specifically the gap between minimum wages and living wages in key garment producing countries, working with our data partner Wage Indicator Foundation to feed that data set. In the commercial pillar, our focus area is purchasing practices. Really, how do we leverage supplier feedback to drive positive developments in commercial relations in the industry, which are really critical for the realization of both social and environmental goals. Working with our data partner, the Better Buying Institute, and their partnership index really to feed this metric. Then in the environmental pillar, the subject of our discussion today, our focus area is greenhouse gas emissions and the reduction of these in line with net zero targets. And as mentioned, AII is our data partner for this metric. So it is with these focus areas in mind that we launched our first pilot iteration of the Industry We Want dashboard. 3 metrics, one on wages, one on purchasing practices, and one on emissions that in 2022 have established a baseline measurement for the industry. We launched the scores of the dashboard earlier in February at the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the garment and footwear sector. And we will be revealing our scores annually around the dates of the forum. So here you see the scores we presented very briefly. The wage score shows the average percentage gap between minimum wages and the average living wage estimate in key garment producing countries in our data set, and that gap is 45%. For purchasing practices, the score shows of a potential rate between -100 to +100, and the score for this metric is 39 for this year. And our emissions metric estimates annual greenhouse gas emissions of the sector to be at 1.025 gigatons. And data for each of these metrics will be updated on an annual basis until at least 2025, so that we can really gauge how the industry is progressing and ask the bigger, the more difficult questions about how to support, stimulate, and really scale progress. It's about how do we transform this industry. So we expected that it can act as an annual traffic light or a sort of temperature check for the industry as a whole, a check-in that will not only stimulate progress, but really importantly support alignment and encourage information exchange, collaboration, and crucially, policy change where it is necessary. So today's session will focus exclusively on the greenhouse gas emissions metric. We only have 8 years left to reach 45% reduction in emissions, which is what we need to limit global warming to 1.5 Celsius. I will now hand it over to Michael and Joel for the deep dive into the report that feeds the industry wants greenhouse gas emissions metric. Over to you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen, and good morning, good evening, or afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Karen. So I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then Joel will join me to just give a quick summary of the roadmap to net zero work that we published with AII, we being World Resources Institute, back in November. It was a work that was generously supported by the Loudest Foundation, so we very much appreciate that. And so we'll give you a quick summary of the findings, and then we'll talk more about the implications for measuring the sector's footprint going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so just for a little bit of context, and we do welcome questions as we go through, so would love to see that Q&A number keep ticking up. So just for some context, back in 2019, WRI published guidance for apparel and footwear sector companies to set science-based climate change targets. We did that because there was a lot of inconsistency with how corporates were setting targets. And frankly, many of the targets were not aligned with what the IPCC said was required to deliver the reductions that we need. And so we published this guidance with the goal of bringing that consistency and clarity and really trying to encourage more companies to set science-based targets. Next slide, please. And science-based targets now seem to be common terminology in the corporate sector right now, but just to set the playing field, these are targets that are in line with what science says is required to keep temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Karen mentioned 8 years, and just to put a finer point on that, about a month ago, the IPCC's latest report essentially said we have 2 years to peak emissions. So annual emissions need to peak within 2 years. We have 8 years to reduce emissions by roughly 45%. And then we have until 2050, no later than 2050, to achieve net zero emissions. So it's enormously ambitious. This is economy-wide. This is not just apparel and footwear, but this is really the foundation for science-based targets. So we have made tremendous progress in the apparel and footwear sector in setting science-based targets. When we issued the guidance, I think there were about a dozen companies that had commitments or approved targets. We're now actually well over 200 companies with approvals or commitments. And so it's been an enormous increase in the numbers. We're also seeing a greater diversity of companies. So it's no longer global multinationals that are setting targets and brands. We see manufacturers, we see local companies, we see greater diversity from a geographic perspective. So it's incredibly encouraging to see the momentum. Next slide. And with that momentum, we turned our attention with the Apparel Impact Institute to provide the how will companies get there. So the science-based targets guidance presented the what, and here's the recipe for getting there. We wanted to outline how the sector can actually deliver against these SBTs. And so working with Joelle and team and Paula at HIG and Textile Exchange, we put together an estimate, our best estimate, based on Textile Exchange and SAC/HIG data of what the global apparel sector contributed in terms of emissions. And you can see that's just over a gigaton, which is just over 1 billion tons in 2019. And unchecked, we'll see those emissions grow up to towards 1.6 gigatons by 2030. We identified a number of interventions that can deliver just over half of the reductions that we need. And then we also talked about the benefits of circular business models. Next slide, please. We'll go through each of those in detail. So if you follow this sector, you know that there have been a number of estimates over the past 5 years of greenhouse gas emissions in the apparel sector. The answer to this question, what are the emissions, is really, it depends. It really depends on the author's data sources and the assumptions. So back in 2017, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation worked with McKinsey to come up with a figure. They found it was about 2%. Qantas, the consultancy, in 2018 came out and said apparel was 6.7%. If you add in footwear, they found that in total it was just over 8%, which is a common number that folks hear. McKinsey worked with Global Fashion Agenda a few years ago and found it was 4%. And then our number was around 2%. So as you can see, this is a pretty decent range of numbers. So 2 to roughly 7%. What we will say, and Joelle will speak more about this in a few moments, is that the data in the industry needs to improve, that we would be very cautious about coming out with any bold statements that the apparel sector is X% definitively. We need to get better with the data, and this is why we chose to use Textile Exchange and HIG/SAC data, because we feel like that's the best data set going forward. And so in a moment, I'll turn it to Joelle, but just very briefly, we were very clear in the report about why we use this data, and then we feel like we were very transparent in how we put these numbers together, essentially looking at only apparel across the value chain. So we didn't have great data for footwear, and we'll try to work that in the future. But maybe Joelle, if you want to flip your camera on and maybe speak at a high level to like how we did the math and how we built this number using HIG MSI data.
Sure, thanks, Michael. Yeah, as Michael kind of alluded to, there's a lot of different assumptions that can be applied that really do end up changing the numbers that come out of this. And I think one of the big pieces that we're excited is not only the number itself, but how do we keep improving that? And we'll get to that later in the presentation. But so what we did for this version is we said, okay, well, where is there relatively good metrics in terms of what's being used by the industry, and really one of those really key pillars is the fiber consumption data that is available, that the Textile Exchange publishes on an annual basis, kind of showing how different fiber are growing, declining, whatever it is. They're pulling the fiber consumption data into the space. So using that kind of as a pillar, saying, okay, well, if we know the fiber data, then we can start to look at what that likely means in terms of processing that fiber into yarns, into textile materials, and ultimately into finished products, and what are some key assumptions that we can make along the way. This is actually one of the areas where Higg MSI data is actually really well suited for this type of analysis, in the sense that a lot of the process data in Higg MSI is meant to represent industry average. And when we're talking of creating an industry benchmark, that's essentially going to be looking at the industry average. So we took the information from Textile Exchange in terms of the amount of fibers that are being produced and consumed. We've made some assumptions around what that means in terms of the apparel sector, because of course there's other users of fibers beyond just apparel, and then looked at, well, what's kind of the breakdown of different spinning methods, whether it's staple, fiber, or filaments, the different yarn spinning losses associated with those. So there's some loss rates that need to be taken into account. And then likewise along the chain saying, okay, well, if we have, these yarns, they can be used in knit fabrics or woven fabrics, they can be prepared in different ways, and ultimately then converted into finished products. So each of these chains, there's data underlying it from the Higg MSI or other data sources to be able to look both at what exists and doing some of the sensitivity analysis on what the key interventions may be. So I think we can go to the next slide. I think it is important to note that like all the approaches, there's going to be limitations. And really this applies whether you're trying to calculate a product footprint, a manufacturer footprint, a brand footprint, an industry sector footprint. There's always going to be some sort of limitations that may exist. So one of those is that the emission factors available in the MSI may not always be representative of actual industry activities or practices. We have what we think is the best available data, but we know that there's also lots of processes that aren't currently captured in the MSI. And one of the advantages of looking kind of at the process chain level is that it highlights some of those opportunities for further data enhancement, that we can actually start to see where the biggest gaps are. The emission factors that are derived from LCAs are representative of what has been measured. So LCA is really good at measuring what has happened. As you apply that to kind of forecasting in the future, there's going to be differences that don't always transfer. So that's where it's still our best guess. It's going to be the best source of that type of information, but there's still limitations we need to recognize. And then really, and this will be interesting with the benchmarking over years, based on the level of information that we had to create this industry benchmark, you can only show improvements in the data points that you're actually measuring and managing. So that's something that we're going to have to really get into too, is that if we're looking at these secondary data of like knit versus woven split, well, how do we actually start to say, what does that mean as you break it down into maybe new processing types or better processing or raw materials data? We need to be able to break it down further. So that's really this last piece, is that in order to get a better benchmark, we really need more and better primary data. And that's why we have the MSI contributor to really be able to work with industry to say, hey, where are there gaps? How do we fill those gaps? Where do we make improvements where the numbers maybe seem wrong? And by driving better data, we're going to be able to drive a more accurate emission profile for the sector. So that's basically what I'm teeing up here on this slide, is that, if we look along the entire life cycle, there's going to be different tools that can play a role. And within the Higg index, we know that there's going to be different tools that really play a role here. So talked about how this one is primarily built on the Higg MSI, some elements with product module when we get into the finished product. But if we want to extend it further into consumer use phase, that's where we could add more data from Higg product module. Or if we want to start to say, well, actually, what are the interventions, the impact of the interventions having in the industry? That's where the Higg facility environment module data really becomes important. And insights from the Higg brand retail module can inform some of the assumptions. So there's this entire ecosystem that really can be used to refine the assumptions and data to continue to drive to a more and more accurate footprint with the added benefit of, if there is a big shift, let's say a change in assumption where we realize that something is wrong, being able to look back and say, okay, what does this mean then if we look back to the current report? Does this actually materially affect the results? All these changes are something that we can measure there. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael to talk about what the actual results were and what some of those interventions that I've been teasing are.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. And we did get a question from Sharif about facility level data from the FEM, to the point that Joel just raised. That's something that we want to incorporate going forward. We want to get primary data from the FEM to refine this estimate, but we didn't have the quality and the amount of data that we wanted for this particular estimate. But going forward, we do want to use the FEM to refine and improve this estimate. So thank you, Sharif, for the question. Great. So also just to say that Joel referenced some of the limitations that we face in coming up with this number. To perhaps state the obvious, the apparel and footwear industry is incredibly complicated, and the industry makes all sorts of products, uses all sorts of materials. It's incredibly difficult to get primary data for the thousands of products that are made, the thousands of materials and facilities. So it's an incredibly challenging exercise to do. So we came up with what we believe is a good estimate. But again, this is why we are very cautious about coming out with these bold claims and saying the apparel sector is X%, because it's our best estimate. So just know that we want to improve this over time, but we are quite mindful of the limitations. Great. So I had mentioned that the total number before. So based on Higg MSI and textile exchange data, we came up with an estimate of just over a gigaton of CO2e. Similar to the other analyses that have been done before us, there are some hotspots. So tier 2, so knitting, weaving, dyeing, finishing, is just over half of total emissions in our analysis. And then raw materials, so cotton farming, extraction of oil and gas for synthetics, is about a quarter. And so while our numbers may differ and the percentages may differ, the hotspots are quite similar. So we know where the emissions lie. Next slide. And as we alluded in the past, if the industry keeps growing on the same trajectory, so let's assume it's growing at around a 3% rate in terms of units sold, and that may even be a low estimate. This is what the industry will be heading towards. So 1.588 gigatons. And yet, we know that to stay within this chance of giving us a 1.5C trajectory, we've got to go down quite a bit. And so we're off pace if we continue this business as usual. So this is the gap that we have to address. Great. So in the roadmap, we identified 6 ways to reduce emissions. And again, I would say there's common perspective across the different reports about what it's going to take to actually reduce emissions. So here we outlined 6, and we noted where we believe they hit in the value chain. And so things like maximizing material efficiency have benefits across the value chain. So how do you make the same product with fewer inputs? How do you scale sustainable materials, things like recycled polyester, recycled cotton, organic cotton? How do we actually go find and accelerate the development of next generation materials? Things like textile to textile recycling, plant-based materials. There are quite a few promising materials out there, most of which we don't really yet know what the greenhouse gas benefits will be. And so there's more analysis. As Joel mentioned, the contributor, the MSI contributor, is a way for companies to submit new data into the MSI. And you can see that there are more and more new materials being submitted to that all the time. Energy efficiency, how do we reduce costs and reduce energy across factories, mills, spinning facilities, et cetera. Coal in material and product manufacturing as a thermal energy source. So there's a fair amount of coal used, for example, in tier 2 for processes such as heating water. And so and we'll talk about this more later, but thermal is a very difficult energy source to address, because it's not like you can just put a rooftop solar farm on a factory or source electricity. This is actual combustion of fuel on site for thermal purposes. So there are not great solutions to that today. And then lastly, shifting to renewable electricity for the electricity needs of facilities. So those are the 6 interventions. You flip to the next slide. So we mapped out in the report, what these 6 interventions could do with various assumptions to take us towards this 45% reduction by 2030. And you can see that even with the 6 interventions, it only takes us, just below where we are in 2019. And so we have this gap of roughly 370 million tons of CO2 that we have to go out and find to really bend that curve down. So in effect, is what we're saying is, like, we've got to do these 6 things that we address in the report, and then do more of those things and other things. And so again, this is a pretty monumental exercise for the industry to take on. And again, we have the details in the report for these 6. Next slide. We also talk about circular business models in the report. And, I think whenever we talk about climate and impact in apparel, I think the question typically comes up like, well, shouldn't we just produce less? Shouldn't we consume less? And, WRI would certainly say yes, like, we need to figure out how do we slow down fashion and consume fewer items per person globally. We believe that models such as resale and rental can reduce emissions, but critically only if they reduce consumption. So if I go out and buy a shirt on a resale platform, I shouldn't go out and buy a brand new shirt in parallel. That's actually got to displace that new shirt. So that's the way that circular models can actually reduce emissions. We've seen data from groups like EMF around extending the life of products, and we need to encourage that. But again, it comes down to this displacement rate. So we need fewer items being purchased. That said, it's really also important from a socioeconomic and a human perspective to understand that there are millions of people that work in the apparel value chain, and many in emerging markets that rely on jobs in this market. And so it's not as simple as just turning down the number of things produced. That's going to have implications for workers and for people. And so we've got to figure that piece out as we shift this way eventually.
So for our upcoming events, we will be discussing these issues and topics further, trying to make more connections as well between all of the 3 different pillars. Our next session is going to be on the 21st of June. That's our wages deep dive. And then in September, we are going to have a conference. We're going to be discussing these bigger questions, and also looking at what policy changes and what other smart mixes, what other instruments we need to be considering for creating the industry that we want. Now, finally, for those that want to join our community, please go onto our LinkedIn, Twitter, and explore, of course, our industry dashboard on theindustryWeWant.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we will be following up with a recording of this session next week. Thank you to our presenters and all your questions as well.